Give us a moment because we appear to only have 2 people in the room. So. Hello everyone, I'm Nicola Solomon, Chief Executive of the Society of Authors. Thank you for joining this event, which is part of our second Society of Authors at Home Festival. Our autumn-winter season is a 9-week programme of online events, which runs until the 10th of December. Most of our events are free to members, and today we've asked non-members to pay. We would ask anyone who can afford it for donations to our Authors Contingency Fund to support authors in financial difficulty due to health crisis, and there'll be a link in the chat. And equally, if you need help, please do apply. You can browse our virtual Blackwell store featuring books by authors and speakers in the Home Festival, and there'll be a link in the chat for purchases there as well. We are very lucky to have as our speaker this week Robert Craig telling us about wills. Today's format will be a quick intro from me, this is it, and then Robert will give a presentation for 20 minutes, and I'll then ask some questions followed by audience questions. Thank you for everyone who's already sent in questions. If you want to submit any during the session, just type them in the chat session and we'll do our best to pick them up. If you're having any connection issues at any time, just press the reconnect button, which tends to work. It's a great pleasure for me to introduce Robert Craig. He's a solicitor at Howard Kennedy. He specialises in wills, trusts, estate planning, probate, charities and partnership. He regularly advises private individuals, business people and well-known authors, artists and actors on estate planning. He, full disclosure, Robert is the person who trained me, so he taught me everything I know. You can blame him if I don't know anything. And outside of work, he's a keen and very skilled woodturner, the founder of the North London Woodturners Group, and he's also a lover of plain English, which really shows in anything he drafts. So over to you, Robert. How do you make a will, and what should our members be doing with their papers and manuscripts?
Good afternoon, everybody. Sound test. Is this all right, Nicola? Is this coming across? Right.
Very good.
Good afternoon, everybody. Everybody should have a well-drafted will. There's a story of a man in the First World War who wrote a will on the inside of his paybook saying, "All to mother." And soldiers in active service are allowed to make informal wills without having a witness. But "all to mother" didn't mean what it seemed to say, because actually mother meant his wife. But it led to a costly battle between his mother and his wife as to which one of them would inherit. So simple and plain wills are not necessarily the answer to everything, and I think everyone should have a properly professionally drafted will. Obviously, I have a vested interest as a solicitor in saying that, but when you consider the problems that arise, having it done properly is a sensible thing. When you're making a will, generally you're disposing of everything you own, except perhaps your pension fund, which is governed by different rules. And when you consider the totality of your assets and you're making arrangements to dispose of those, it makes sense to have someone look over your affairs as a whole and give you advice and try and achieve the result that you really want. And there are all sorts of common fallacies, people who believe that their partners will inherit from them because they are what used to be called common law wives or common law husbands. And so if you don't make a will, the intestacy rules apply, which are rules laid down by Parliament to cover the generality of cases where people don't make wills. So, for example, you have someone who had, say, 2 children outside matrimony years ago, and now has a partner who might be the mother of the children or might not be the mother of the children, and then assumes that his partner or her partner is going to inherit their estate, and so they don't need to make a will. Under the intestacy rules, your partner does not inherit, only your legal spouse or civil partner, and therefore it would be the children who inherited, possibly cutting or probably cutting out your longtime partner, and the children are not necessarily the children of that person, so they may all be at loggerheads. So the intestacy rules are a kind of one-size-fits-all. For example, as a generality, if you die without a will, your spouse, if you have a proper spouse, married or civil partner, your spouse inherits the first £270,000 of your estate, plus your personal possessions, which would not include your literary rights, and the remainder is split between your children and the other half, in which you get a life interest. Now, in terms of tax, in terms of what people want, and in terms of what the £270,000 will qualify you for, in terms of a house almost anywhere in the country, that arrangement is almost certain to leave your spouse much worse off than the will you would make, probably leaving all or the bulk of your estates to your spouse. So again, that's a reason, even if you've got a regular setup, you've got a spouse and you've got children, that's a good reason for making a proper will. So how do you set about making your will? Well, I'm going to assume that you're not going to do a homemade will, writing all to mother on the inside of your paybook, but you're going to go and see a solicitor. How can you make the process painless and speedy and efficient? I suggest that you begin by making a list of your key assets. The solicitor won't need to know to the penny what you've got, won't even necessarily need to know, for example, where your bank accounts are, but needs a list that says bank accounts, insurance, house, mortgage, and so on, so that the solicitor has got something to start with which they can take in at a glance. Then also in preparation, you need to think about who the people are that you want to leave your assets to. If it's your children, put them down on the same piece of paper, your spouse's name, legally married on such and such a date, the names of the children, and how old they are, because your will is likely to have different provisions according to whether you have got very young children who may need protection or adult children who won't need that protection. And the other thing to think about, and to be candid with the solicitor about, is whether the people that you're including in your list of beneficiaries get on with each other. If they don't get on with each other, and you leave your, for example, your literary rights equally between them, and they all hate each other's guts, there is not likely to be harmony in terms of managing your literary affairs, or in terms of who gets your house, who gets your jewelry, who gets your fantastic collection of books or whatever. So you do need to consider whether the beneficiaries get on with each other. And I would have this on your little piece of paper to tell your solicitor at the start of the meeting, or even better in advance, so that they know where they're coming from. It is surprising when I deal with people and I take instructions for wills, how you have to drag information out of people. They tell you they've got a house somewhere. They don't mention they have a mortgage. They say, and there's the children, and you have to ask how old the children are. And also, I have to say whether the children have got any disabilities, because clearly if you have children with disabilities, whether they are just physical disabilities and then need more help in life, or whether they have mental capacity issues and will need some kind of protection, that is something which is really important for the person making a will to know about, and you should tell them rather than simply just assume. I made a will for somebody in the 1990s, and he came in with his wife and they told me they had one son. They didn't say anything about the son's capacity. He was about 12 or 14 at the time. Later on, the wife died, and then eventually the husband died. And the estate agents who were dealing with the house said to me that the son was nowhere to be found. The estate agents told me that there were squatters in the house. It turned out it wasn't a squatter. It turned out it was their son who had disabilities, who couldn't manage his affairs. He didn't know how to cook a meal, and he'd set fire to the house or part of the house. And the whole, eventually we found him. We've set him up as a disabled person, and he's getting benefits. But as his father, the surviving parent, left everything to him, so he has inherited this money, and it's caused havoc with his benefits because he's a person with significant assets who's not entitled to many benefits. So that's the kind of information which your solicitor or the person making your will want to know about. Have any of the beneficiaries got disabilities? Do they all get on with each other? And generally, an interview will extract this information from you in half an hour, but I'm just suggesting you give your lawyer a head start by jotting it down in an organized fashion. You're all writers. You all know what to do. You know how to express yourselves. Give it to the solicitor here at the start of the meeting. This is what we've got. The question, who is going to manage your estate when you die? Executors. All authors love the idea of having literary executors, nearly all, because they think it sounds good, because they think they need to have literary executors. They need someone with the sensitivity to handle your affairs and manage your literary rights for the whole period of copyrights, the next 70 years. And so they fancy the idea of having a literary executor because they heard that other famous authors did that. Now, a literary executor, an executor is a person who deals with your affairs and winds up your estate when you've died. There are all sorts of executors. You can have an agricultural executor if you have a farm and you think that you need a specialist executor to handle your farm. So you have general executors who look after your money, and you have agricultural executors. You can probably have you can have business executors who, for example, if you own a brewery, you're lucky enough to own a brewery, then you have business executors who, I was going to say drink the beer. They look after that side of things, and your general executors who look after the money and your house and so on. So literary executors are not in legal terms, not a special category of executors. They are simply people who are tasked with the idea of managing your literary rights. And it is advisable when you make a will and if you decide to have literary executors, to say precisely what assets the literary executors are to have control over and what assets the other executors are going to have control over. But many people making wills, even authors, will not need literary executors at all. If you have one or two books which are not yet selling fantastically well, and you have a relatively small income from your literary rights, you may not need a literary executor. You may be able to leave it to the executors, general executors. And also you need to consider who the people are who are going to inherit. If you have a spouse and your spouse is perfectly capable of managing your literary rights after your death, then why not appoint your spouse as your executor? come back to who else you might need as executor, and they will be able to manage your rights and organize things to the best advantage of your estate. In choosing executors, the general executors, I mean, you're looking for someone who is reasonably businesslike, will be able to take it on and devote a little bit of time to your affairs, will be able to understand any legal ramifications involved, and will be able to manage ongoing assets such as your literary estate. And it's quite likely that you'll have family members who'll be able to do this. Now, if the family members are all squabbling with each other and can't reach agreement, then you need to look to outside help, which could be a cousin, a friend, just one or other of the squabbling family members, but not all of them, or you use a professional like a solicitor, your accountant, your financial advisor, somebody you trust who's going to be able to deal with your affairs in a fairly business-like way and get on with providing a transition between your estate where you're alive and you own everything to the subsequent state where you're not there, you've died, and you want your assets to go to your beneficiaries. So generally speaking, unless there are serious legal issues, it's not something that needs a person who has got tremendous legal or accounting skills. It's a matter of common sense. Will this person be able to handle my affairs? Lots of people do like to have a solicitor as one of the executors. Generally speaking, we tend to find that legal fees of winding up an estate are less when you have a solicitor executor, because they know what they're doing and they don't necessarily have to keep going backwards and forwards to the family for instructions or the kind of interplay of information between the executors and the beneficiaries. But it's a matter of personal choice, and you need to have to find someone who's got a good relationship and you think is going to be really reasonably competent. I'm just dealing with the last stages of an estate of an eminent author who picked her solicitor to be her sole executor and sat on the estate for 5 years without doing anything or without telling the charity who were the main beneficiary that they'd even inherited anything from her. So that's neither a warning for or against having solicitors, but a matter of picking a person you think will be able to do the job properly. If you choose to have literary executors because your literary rights are going to be complicated, there's going to need to be someone who's going to deal with your literary side of things in an efficient way, to allocate the receipts from your literary rights between family members, then, and perhaps deal with your papers, your foreign rights, translation rights. Very often you'll have an agent who'll be able to do much of the donkey work of that and handle the, what you might say, the detailed side of it in an efficient way. But the literary executor is an interface between the people who are supposed to be paying the money and the people who ultimately are supposed to be receiving the money. So the question's been asked, should you have your literary agent as your executor? Personally, I don't think that's a good starting place, because the literary agent is in a position of conflict. The literary agent wants to look after, they're a professional, they're carrying on their business and they are benefiting from their percentage on your literary rights. And they may not actually have any special expertise in dealing with the family and the family arguments that are going to go on if they go on. or with your more general affairs. On the whole, I prefer a system in which you have a literary executor who deals with the agent, and the agent reports to the literary executor and says, this is what we think we should do, this is what we've sold, this is what we can't sell. And the literary executor then makes decisions and is responsible for getting in the money and parceling it out among your beneficiaries. Really, each case needs to be looked at individually as to what your situation is. But to summarize, you don't necessarily need a literary executor if you've got a small literary estate and it's not complicated. You probably do need a literary executor if you have got a large, complicated body of work, if you've got rights coming in from all sorts of places, if you've got complicated papers, if you, I'll come back to papers in a minute, but in a situation of complexity where you feel your family may not be able to handle the literary side of things, then have a literary executor. People are often very concerned about their papers, either in a positive or negative way. Some authors say, I want all my papers destroyed and I don't want any unpublished work to be published. If I haven't published it in my lifetime, or it's not with a publisher at the moment, I want it all burned, and that's what the executor should be doing. And other people say, I want every scrap of paper preserved. I would like it presented to some museum or the British Library. And if that's what you want, I would suggest that you speak to the receiving institution to start with and find out whether they would be interested, whether they'd be paying money for your archive, and explore that while you're still alive, when frankly you're in a better position to negotiate than if you just have a large mass of unsorted papers. And let's make the point here that the tidier your affairs are, the easier it will be across the whole board of things, general executors and literary executors. The tidier your affairs are, the easier it will be for your family and your executors to sort matters out. There are some people who love to have unsorted papers. It's a security aspect. If nobody can find anything, then I'm not at risk of being hacked. If it's easy to find, someone might get control of it. The fact that you write on really obscure subjects and have only a tiny, unfortunately tiny literary income doesn't affect the principle that the more muddle, the safer I am. But my recommendation to you is that you put your affairs in reasonably good order. That's not to say you're about to pop off, but it is a good idea to have a chuck out every few years. Now, I have a special way of doing this, which I recommend to you. Get a large cardboard box, or if you are a hoarder of papers, a series of large cardboard boxes. Put anything which seems to you to be redundant, but which you can't completely bear to part with, into a large cardboard box and tape it shut. And write on the outside, for destruction, 5 years' time. Almost certainly you will not need to refer to the contents of the box. And in 5 years' time, shred, burn, recycle, or whatever you want to with the contents. But if it hasn't come up in 5 years, it probably is never going to. Obviously, there's an exception in the case of your precious literary papers, which, if you're planning to sell them, you want to keep inviolate, and the more help you can give to your ultimate archivist or to the museum or to your literary executor, the better. People ask about things, online things and passwords and so on. I have yet to find that any online service is very responsive to any instructions that are given by a testator. People are remarkably unhelpful. So my recommendation is as follows, that you provide a list of your passwords to your closest friend, your executor, and whatever, that you enable them to have access to anything which is filed, anything which you don't want people to see because it's deeply private, pornographic, obsolete, just delete. And if it might be useful for the archive, print it out and don't leave it in electronic form. And that will make life much easier for your executors. Included in that are passwords to access your bank accounts and so on. Oops, something popped up. Nicola, can you think of anything from your experience that I haven't, any area that I haven't covered before we go on to questions?
Well, we've got so many questions. I think that a lot of the questions will come up as we go through. I mean, that's an amazing whistle-stop tour, but shall I maybe ask a couple of things that I've got before I let everyone else have them? One quick practical one, a couple of people have said they've had connection problems and actually just pressing reconnect often works for that. I've got one question which will probably be of relevance to a lot of our members. What if my copyrights are owned by a company? Will that automatically go in the will, or what will happen when I die?
Right. If your copyrights are owned by a company, then what you have got to leave is not copyrights. What you've got to leave is shares in the company. So you've simply swapped one form of property, literary rights, for another form of property, shares in a company which owns literary rights. Now, who will control those? It will be the other directors of the company, which probably is your spouse or your children. And it'll be the company which keeps going and collects money for the literary rights and has to deal with distribution of funds to your beneficiaries over future years. But and you may still want to give instructions as to what to do with the rights, what to do with your papers, and so on. Sometimes people hold on to their papers, sometimes people actually transfer the archive to a company, but there's nothing. You might still need to have a literary executor because the literary executor is going to be dealing with the copyrights. On the other hand, their position is subject to the rights of the directors of the company, who, as I say, I find usually it's the person's spouse or children. So I'm not sure that answers the question, but essentially you're leaving shares and not rights.
And another question, what about joint property? So if you're your own joint copyrights, what would happen there?
You can only, as an author with jointly owned copyrights, move at the pace of the slower of the two people. So that's one of the problems. For example, if you leave your rights to your children, one of whom is only 2 years old, and to an aged relative who may not know what to do with them or may not know anything about anything, and to a friend who you haven't seen for 20 years, and all those people are going to have to cooperate in order to exploit your literary rights. That's the advantage of having a literary executor. And I've lost you, so I'm going to
We've lost your picture, Robert, but we can still hear you. So probably if you leave it for a moment, it'll come back.
Okay. If the rights are held by a number of people, whether it's your co-owner or it's people who've inherited from you, you need to think how that process will be managed. And one way of doing it is to give the literary executor sufficient power to manage your literary rights without having to refer back to the various co-owners. the various co-owners, whether they are your co-writer of a work that you agree with on this or your beneficiaries, they have an interest in getting the money from the exploitation of your rights rather than the making decisions on what to do with exploiting the rights. So without wanting to introduce complication, my preferred way of doing this is to have the literary executor with the powers of a manager so that they can handle the rights with full autonomy to do so, rather than have to keep referring back to the aged aunt, the one-year-old child, the squabbling relatives.
Okay, I'm going to go through a few questions we've had, some of which are similar to these, but I think are really worth doing. It's also worth saying, and we'll put up a guide later, but the Society of Authors has a whole guide to your papers and your rights after your death. Robert was very helpful in drafting the guide. We'll put up the link, which is free to members at any point. One of the questions that Sophia Kutlaki asked is, does a writer's estate also include provisions on their joint property with their spouse, or is it acceptable to have a literary will for royalty, legacy, etc., and another will relating to your property?
Starting in the end, you only want one will, unless, of course, you happen to own foreign property, the villa in Spain, the yacht moored somewhere. You only want one will for your UK assets. Jointly owned property in this country have two ways of owning jointly owned property. And confusingly, one of those ways is called joint ownership, and the other is called tenancy in common, which is nothing at all to do with tenancy. Now, if you and your spouse, say, own a house, you may, and more usually will be, joint tenants, which is nothing to do with tenancy, but on one of you dying, it automatically goes to the survivor. The other way of holding property together is as a tenant in common, where if you die, your rights in, as it were, half the house or half the proceeds of sale of the house can be left by your will to whoever you want. For most people, in most situations, it's easier to be joint tenants, and you are likely only to be tenants in common if you've had an inheritance and you've both inherited the house, or if you have certain tax saving arrangements where you want to deal separately with your half of the house and your spouse's half of the house. So in making your will, the lawyer who's dealing with it will want to know whether you jointly own the house or whether you are tenants in common, and that's very easily discovered from a search at the land registry. In the case of rights, if you have a co-owner, almost certainly you're tenants in common. That's to say, when you've your rights in your half of the royalties belong to you and can be left by you in your will, and the same for your writing partner. But it's not always the case. You might decide it would be simpler for your writing partner to take the lot, and that's something to be discussed with the lawyer to make appropriate arrangements. So I think I'll question again.
I think you're holding some papers or something a bit near the microphone, so
right.
See if you can move them back a bit.
Right.
We've been asked by Terry, is it better to go with a lawyer or an estate planner when making a will? And we're also being asked, what are the likely costs of a solicitor doing your will for you?
I'm not sure what an estate planner is. The recognised professions or activities, you've got a lawyer, an accountant, a financial advisor. Someone who says, I'm an estate planner, what are they doing? Are they just an unqualified lawyer? I don't know. You'd have to find out what the person is, what their qualification is, and whether they actually know what they're doing. If it's a financial advisor who calls themselves an estate planner, then really you need to know, do they actually know anything about making wills, or is there expertise, and it may be considerable, is their expertise related to life policies, pension plans, and so on. I wouldn't normally expect to go to your solicitor to get detailed financial advice on your life policy, and I wouldn't expect to go to a financial advisor to draft a will for you. Each has got something to contribute to the process, but not necessarily to get them to draft your will.
And I'm going to say something which Robert really can't say, but there are complications with literary estates, and therefore, if you go to a solicitor, do go to somebody who knows something about literary estates, both because it can be incredibly helpful for tax, and also because we at the Society of Authors see wills where whoever drafted them clearly don't know what to do with literary estates. Something else you can do if it's not worth them, the finance of going to a complex solicitor, are to go to us and ask for those particular bits for advice, because it is a specialist area. Robert's hidden his face to hide his blushes here, but he is very good at it. Another question, Robert, that we've had here in relation to the executive question is, being a literary executor can involve a lot of work, and I wouldn't ask anyone to do it for nothing. What's the best way to pay them? Splitting the royalties would be complicated. I've thought of leaving a lump sum in my will. Does that sound sensible?
Well, if you leave a lump sum in your will, that's fine, I suppose, for the person who receives it. But bear in mind that possibly your literary estate is going to meander on for 70 years. And while the first literary executor collected his or her legacy, when there was a lot of money in the estate, what's going to be the position in 20 years' time when literary rights are not producing as much money and that person doesn't have the benefit of the legacy? You know, they say that income from literary estates goes up when someone dies and then declines until someone brings out a biography, when it goes up again. And then it declines until your centenary of your birth, usually centenary of your birth. And at that point, the income from the rights goes up, and then sadly it may decline over the remainder of the 70 years. So to answer the question, I think it's better perhaps to include a percentage of the income as an authorized amount which the literary executor can take. What's involved? Well, it depends on the complexity of your literary affairs. I think if you're asking a family member, a friend to do it, they won't necessarily expect a reward. But if you want to give them something for their time and trouble, then a personal legacy is a good idea. But don't imagine that it's necessarily going to pay a significant amount over the whole 70 years, in which case a percentage of collections will be appropriate.
Another question that we're being asked about is giving money to charity. Is that a good idea, and how do you do it? And if you do give your estate to charity, would you make them the executors?
Is it a good idea? Of course, we're all in favour of charity. But are you leaving enough for your family? So there's a balance between spouse, children, charity. The advantage of making a gift to charity in your will is that if you give at least 10% of your net taxable estate to charity, then the rate of inheritance tax on the net estate goes down from 40% to 36%. So there's a little bit of sort of payback or reward from the government. I think if you feel like giving some of your estate to charity, which is excellent, you need to decide whether you've got particular charities in mind, if you've been associated with them, if you've supported them. You name them in the will, and if you want simply to leave it to your executors to choose charities, that's also perfectly all right. What I would say is, don't pick a charity out of spite to get at your relatives. There was a famous case recently where someone left money to an animal charity simply because she didn't like her daughter, and she thought, I'll show her, I'll leave all my money to, I think it was just an animal rescue centre. I'd rather the animals have it than her.
Yes, well, it's not very nice. There has been some questions which I may be able to answer about making the Society of Authors the beneficiary of a literary estate, also making the Society of Authors the literary executor. And this ties in because the first thing is the Society of Authors generally suggests that you might want to leave them to one of our associated charities, which will help you in tax and be sensible, but also the question that was asked by Linda, by Linda Hartley, was that I have a small estate and that could change. Would it be something the Society of Authors is interested in and the work involved worth it? And the answer to that is always on these cases, come and talk to us and we'll be able to give you a steer as to whether we are likely to want to take them on. Because this ties with the question, a much more general question that I would ask you, Robert, is should you tell the people you are making your literary executors that you are planning to do it? And indeed, can they say that they don't want to be your literary executors?
No one is compelled to take up an appointment as an executor. So in talking about general executors, I normally recommend to people that they have a first and second line of defence. If the person I've named can't do it or won't do it, then I appoint B or C, or maybe as a last resort, my lawyer. Now, in the case of a literary estate, I think there is a good reason for asking your prospective literary executor whether they would be willing to do this, bearing in mind that it can be quite a complex job. Particularly if there are papers involved, there's going to be a lot of record keeping and dealing with your literary agent. And particularly if people have already agreed to be someone else's literary executor, that can be a burden. So I think it's quite a sensible idea to say to the prospective literary executor, would you do it? There's no compulsion to tell them, and there's no compulsion on them to accept it. So perhaps it's a good plan.
And when your literary executor dies in turn, what happens?
Very good question. Because an executor acting as an executor can't simply appoint someone else to be an executor. And I thought about this. I somehow knew this question was going to come up. If you appoint someone as your executor and they hand the estate over to your trustees to administer trusts on your behalf, even if it's the same person, they just sort of reinvent themselves. I am now a trustee and I've finished the administration of the estate and I'm now the trustee for the Smith family. Then they can appoint more trustees. If they're appointed as an executor and they die, the person who takes over the executorship is the surviving executors. And if they're the last surviving executor, then their own executors become your executors, which is not something that you want. So that ties in with the idea that you appoint a literary executor, but you give them the powers of a manager, and you actually say in the will what is to happen to your estate when the literary managers come to retire or the literary executor comes to retire. This or that person has power to appoint somebody to continue to maintain a succession.
So is it the trick then, and something that we suggest often, that you have one set of executors only, but you have what you might call a literary manager or a literary trustee, and that way you only have to take out one grant of probate, but you hand over all the management of the literary estate, which after all will last much longer, the 70 years, quite early on, but you just have one general set of executors and then these literary managers or trustees, as opposed to calling them executors.
Yeah, I think that's a very good plan. There are some cases where you would certainly want a literary manager. I'm dealing with somebody, one of our ancient universities, who has been appointed as a literary executor. The level of the royalties is very small, but the complexities of authorizing articles, editing material and so on, considerable complexities. And there I think there's a good case for saying to someone, look, you become the literary executor, you're going to take this on as a labor of love, and it's not going to generate much money, but there's a high degree of kudos.
And another question, quite different, is does the law in Scotland different to English law in regard to these to property and property?
I'll be quite honest, I don't know much about Scottish law. Isn't that mad? But it's rather like now we're seeing about COVID. Every part of the country has different regulations.
You've had a recent will, Margaret Scales. Can you add a codicil to cover your literary assets?
You've made a will, but now you've written a best-selling book, or not a best-selling book. Can you add a codicil? Yes, you can add a codicil. You'll need to think about, or your lawyer will need to think about how you dovetail the codicil with the will. But that's the way to do it.
And Catherine Macbeth asks, what happened to the royalties which continue to come in after you die? Presumably a new bank account would need to be set up to receive the money. And does that need to belong to one individual, or would it be a trust which then distributes the money to all your beneficiaries?
There's no rule that you have to close the bank account if it's a bank account for literary money. And perhaps I should come back and say something about that in a moment. But generally, you'll want a bank account which is dedicated to receiving literary receipts. And then out of that bank account, you pay whoever's entitled, beneficiaries. Can I say a word about business property relief?
Please, I love business property relief, as you know.
The good news, people out there, is that because you're carrying on the profession of an author, your literary assets are free of inheritance tax, as quite right too. So there will not normally be the same complexities of inheritance tax in dealing with those assets. Now, if you've inherited literary assets from your spouse or from some distant uncle, they no longer carry business property relief, because the essence of the relief is not that you own literary rights, but that you created them, or that you're at least carrying on a business of dealing with the literary receipts during your lifetime. And it's very important that you should be carrying on a business. And so I want to say to everybody out there, never retire. And when I used to do a talk like this in person with an audience, there were always a number of, let's say, white-haired elderly authors in the audience who would nod vigorously at this point and mutter, never retire, never retire. And so I would say it's important not to announce your retirement, always to have something on the go, There's always a new edition to be brought out, or a revision, or a rewriting, or a plan on the stocks, so that your executors can say to the Inland Revenue, Mr. Mrs. X was an active author who was carrying on the profession of an author right up to the time they died, and their literary assets, which would include all their writings, their archive, their computer, their research library, all should be exempt from inheritance tax. But what about the money in the bank? If you take all the money out of that bank account that Nicola and I just talked about, and you stick it in with your general money, it's no longer really money limited to linked to your profession as an author. It's really just general money. So my suggestion would be that if you have at least a reasonable amount of money kept in a bank account, which is called Mrs. X authorship account, and you keep a reasonable amount of that to pay for foreign trips, research trips, subscriptions, membership of the Society of Authors, and so on, then all the money in that account is likely also to be free of inheritance tax as part of your business assets. That doesn't mean to say that you can warehouse millions of pounds in your literary estate because you happen to inherit them from some distant relative and you stick them in the literary account. That won't work. But anything which is genuinely linked to your activities as an author will, if it's put into a separate account, will be exempt from inheritance tax.
And that, I must say, is one of the things that I often find that people don't know and is really worth knowing, and is really worth telling a general solicitor if you're making a will with them. Now, a completely different question to which you may know the answer and I'm not sure about. Are civil partnerships difficult to arrange in lockdown? I think the answer is it depends how many guests you want, but I wouldn't absolutely swear on it. You probably need to go and find out elsewhere. I don't know if you've got anything to add to that, Robert.
No.
Samurai Haynes asked, should you have a disabled trust or discretionary trust for an adult child? I assume it means an adult.
That is a very difficult and important question, and I think you need to take specialist advice. But the short answer would be that there is a general discretionary trust which enables the trustees or the executors who become trustees administering your estate to decide who gets what income or capital out of your estate. And the advantage of that is that they can keep the money away from your disabled child until they actually need it. The risk of them having rights in the money is that it will wreak havoc with their benefits. Now, a disabled person trust is another version of a discretionary trust, which has different tax rules applied. And which one you go for depends on your family circumstances. What I don't recommend is that you just leave if you have a disabled child, it's a whole different discussion. But you have to assume that your child who with a disability needs protection and needs specialist advice to make sure that their money is dissipated by other members of the family who are included in the trust.
That's really helpful, thank you. Jill Calder says, and there are other questions along the same lines, can the SOA help advise on the best way to sort out a long lifetime of work, papers, artwork, and also digital files? It feels very overwhelming to know where to start. Which I can really only say, I feel your pain, Jill. I think possibly Robert's advice about tidying it up every few years might be the start. But have you got anything to add to that?
If you look on it as an opportunity to revisit your achievements over the years, an opportunity to reflect on what you've done, to chuck out bits that you don't want anyone else to see, then it's not entirely a painful job. If you look on it as a terrible chore, at least feel it's better that you're doing the chore and you're doing the chucking out rather than some other person who you've appointed as executor, you didn't tell them, and then they find out they've been appointed as your executor and there is a house full of papers which they've got to sort out before they can even begin to deal with the money.
And Elise Morbida asked, please explain what a trust is and how it should be set up.
Big question.
You've only got about 2 minutes left.
Okay, in my 2 minutes. A trust is a legal entity in English law, which is a set of rules for how money is to be administered. And it can be in various forms, between someone having the right to it while they're alive and then it passes to other people afterwards, or a trust where a number of people can share and the trustees take decisions about how the money is to be used. If you think that something like this may be appropriate to you, you need specialist advice, not from an estate planner. You need to go to a lawyer who knows about trust law, and you can either set the trust up in your lifetime as a document, or you can set it up in your will. And it's a whole wonderful branch of British jurisprudence which requires specialist advice. That's not to put anybody off. Trusts are very important and very, very useful. But the opportunity for things to go wrong is considerable.
Going back to your business relief point, Helen Cromitty asks, if you have a company that receives your royalties and so on, is that company eligible for business rollover relief? In
general, yes.
And Richard Evans has asked, are literary assets the rights to your work rather than the royalties? And there's a second question which I'll ask along with that, because there was a question about, when we've been talking about literary assets, does that also include your visual assets? If, for example, you're an illustrator as well, are we talking about all rights here, or do you have to divide those separately?
I didn't get the first part of that. So
the first question is, does literary assets mean the rights to your work as opposed to just the rights to royalties?
It includes the rights to your work, so that, for example, you could exercise the right negatively. Someone says, may I republish something? May I quote extensively from your work? The answer is no, I don't want you to do it. So in that situation, it's nothing to do with the money. In fact, you might be giving up money, but you're in charge of how your work is used. And of course, it's not only literary copyright, it is also visual copyright. So broadly the same rules and considerations apply, except that in the case of literary rights, it's pure rights that go on being exploited for 70 years. And in the case of visual material, the original work may have been sold. In fact, generally the executors of an artist's estate will be trying to sell the work over a period, but it's the rights of reproduction and so on, the right of exploitation of the visual rights, which comes later. But generally it's to do with, in the case of an artist, it's disposing of the original work.
And Christopher Naylor says, where should one file a will? It's possible to file a will with the principal probate registry, but the standard form they issue to accompany the will states the person making the will undertakes to notify the executors immediately of their appointment. So can you file a will without telling your executors? Basically, where should you keep your will? And I think it's a really important question.
Leave your will with the solicitor, have a copy at home, prominently marked, even if you live on your own, propped up on the mantelpiece, but leave the original with the solicitor and keep a record of exactly where it is. There is a registry of wills which was set up in the probate registry a very long time ago, and no one I know has ever done it except a former partner of mine who was an eccentric person who decided to file his will with the probate registry, and everything went wrong. I won't go into more detail, but he changed it, he made a codicil, and when we came to get probate of his will, there was an almighty mess.
Oh, and can I add something to that, which seems really gruesome, because people don't mind talking about wills, but really hate talking about burial. But really tell all the people who are closest to you What do you want done about burial? Because wills are very often not read till really quite a long time after you've been buried. Your grieving relatives do not think of your will. Your grieving relatives think about what to do with your body. And it's only then a month later, when they've cremated you, that they ceremoniously open your will and find out that you want to be buried. So don't put it there. Make sure that everyone closest to you knows. I'm sure you agree with this.
Exactly. I have heard of a case where someone wanted to be buried at sea, but they didn't look at the will until he'd already been cremated, and they had to scatter ashes over the waters.
Yes, and Justina Hart asks, can you explain what letters of wishes are and why they're different from the main body of the will?
Right, particularly if you have a trust, but not only, you might want to give guidance to your executors as to how they're to deal with your assets. And a letter of wishes is a more formal way to express that than simply writing a note. So you might say, I want you to look after my wife particularly, or my husband particularly. I don't think the old farm ought to be sold. I'd like that to stay in the family. I know I've left it in a trust for my 3 nephews, but if any of them is interested in farming, I would like it to go to them and not to those who are not interested in farming, and the people not interested in farming ought to get money instead. So you can be more expansive, and you can, as long as the lawyer says you're not actually sort of contradicting the will, it does enable you in a non-formal and non-binding way to enable you to express your wishes. And that would be particularly useful in the case of an author who might want to say, I don't want any of my work published in this country or that country, or I don't want any of my work to be unpublished work to be published after my death. Burn it.
And of course, that part isn't published publicly, is it? Or is it a little letter?
No.
Because we sometimes, for the charitable, I mean, we've got a lot of charitable estates which have come in wills, and often the people who endowed our charities left us quite private notes about exactly how they wanted us to deal with those, which they didn't necessarily want published, but they wanted us to have an indication.
Yeah.
Bridget Cleave says, is it possible to quantify at what point all of this is necessary? I have a very small amount of royalties every year, and it hardly seems worth it.
And I would ask, is it Richard? I would ask Richard, who is it going to? Sorry?
Bridget, yes.
Bridget. I'm sorry, Bridget. Who is it going to? Is it all going to one person? How old is that person? Is it going to come in for the whole of their lifetime because they're a 1-year-old child? Or is it going to be only for a very short time because they're already 90? And it's up to you to judge whether there's an asset which can usefully go to somebody under your will for a period of 70 years. And if you decide that nobody's going to republish it and it's all going to be out of date in a couple of years' time, then don't bother. But if it's of long-lasting benefit, then I would certainly recommend you make a will, and that your will should deal with your literary rights.
And Robert, we've been asked several times and we didn't answer. How much is it going to cost you to have your will made?
Are you a multi-million selling author with a large estate who has complex literary rights throughout the world and deals with the literary, or doesn't deal with a literary agent, you do it all yourself? Or are you a person with one bank account in a rented flat with a small number of personal possessions? So it can be anything from £300-400 plus VAT, unfortunately, up to £3,000 or £4,000. It depends on the complexity of the job, and of course, the more complex the situation, the more it's necessary. So that's the only guidance I give. It should not be as much as £5,000 or £10,000, and it shouldn't be. It's not peanuts. And the people who say they'll do it for free, well.
And it's certainly true that the people who say they'll do it for free if you give to a certain charity do not normally assume that you're going to be having a literary estate as part of it.
Yeah.
Well, we've lost Robert for the moment, but actually we've also run out of time. So I think that I will we'll start drawing it to an end. Don't forget, though, that the Society of Authors team can advise on any questions, and that is both that before you've made a will, or if you've got any questions about estates, drop us an email and we will point you in the right direction, whether that's finding a solicitor, whether it's advising on any of these points or anything about it. We are incredibly open to generally address it to me, and I'm very happy to have a chat with anybody about it. But also, once someone's died, we will, their estates can remain members of the Society of Authors, and we can give a lot of general guidance, and often do, to estates at the point of death. And we, of course, have this guide that we'll send on. So don't forget to come to the Society of Authors first on all of these issues. But look, he's back, so I can say a good thank you. Huge thanks to Robert. That's been incredibly helpful, and we'll put your details in the chat as well. And I'm sad to say we're really at the end, but thank you to Francesca, who's been our moderator. Thank you to everybody who's listened in. Just to remind you that all our sessions are free, but if you can afford to donate a few pounds to the Authors Contingency Fund to support authors in financial difficulty, please do. Please don't forget to buy our books if you want to. And please don't forget to join the rest of our events. On Thursday, we've got an afternoon tea with Margaret Atwood, but we've got a huge amount of exciting events going on to the end of the year. Recordings from our festival are available, and again, there'll be links in the chat. Thanks again to Robert. We can continue the conversation on Twitter, and see you all soon at the next event. Thank you, and thank you very much, Robert. And I will close us off.